so happy we alive.
Well-educated, middle class, or rich marijuana users will have to come out of the closet and declare, I am a marijuana smoker, but I am not a criminal. And I applaud Governor Gary Johnson of New Mexico for having said exactly that. Or he said, I am a former marijuana smoker, and when I was a marijuana smoker, I was not a criminal. And other Americans who don't smoke marijuana but do love freedom will have to join those people in demanding an end to prohibition. And I suggest that we start this year, it's an election year, by making sure that every candidate for office this year, at every town meeting, at every public appearance, answers one simple question. Where in the Constitution do you find the power to tell adult Americans what they can smoke in their own bodies? Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. And we'll have a few minutes of questions if anybody has any questions. Yes?
As a libertarian and a cannabis activist, the question is, how do we tear down those restrictions? My thoughts are repeal the restrictions, and the lawyer I was just talking to said somehow the government's doing it through the commerce laws. Is that valid?
Well, there's a sense in which everything the government does, if you ask them where they get the authority in the Constitution, which people don't often know, they will say the Commerce Clause. If you grow wheat in your own crop and feed it to your own cows, they will regulate it and say it's the Commerce Clause. If you carry a gun within 1,000 feet of a school, that's what the Lopez case was about, they will say, well, it's the Commerce Clause. In fact, it was an absolutely absurd Supreme Court decision by, or Supreme Court dissent, fortunately, by Stephen Breyer, who's generally, I think, a sensible and intelligent man, but he defended the federal government's power to say you couldn't carry a gun within 1,000 feet of a school, which may very well be a good rule, but if it is, you know, we've got 16,000 school districts and they can make those rules. He said the federal government could do it because studies show, and he went through a lot of economics, that well-educated people are more economically productive. And I guess some studies also show that guns in the classroom make it difficult to educate, and therefore the federal government could do this. It was an interesting policy argument, just had nothing to do with the Constitution. I think you're going to hear 3 days worth of discussion here about strategies for change, and I'm not an expert on it. I would say the one main thing you have to have is you got to have more people standing up and saying, this is my freedom and I want the right to engage in it. And it's a problem because, of course, you're announcing you're doing something illegal. And anybody would worry that if you went on television and said that, can they come to your house at that point? That's a real issue. And so I understand why people hesitate to do this. But I think that's the most important aspect. Then, what are we trying to achieve? Well, I think that's something that not everybody in this room would agree with. My own view is I'm trying to achieve as liberal or libertarian a regime as possible. I don't think drugs should be available to children. You shouldn't be able to drive while you're intoxicated. A few rules like that. But otherwise, I think that marijuana should be available to adults as freely as alcohol is. Not everybody agrees with exactly that description. I would say, as a matter of federalism, we should start by repealing all the federal drug laws and then talk to the state legislatures about what should be done in the states. And that happened, you know, back in 1933 when they repealed the federal prohibition law. Then it was up to the state legislatures. And as you know, some states, as late as about 1980, continued to outlaw alcohol. I don't think there's really any prohibition like that anymore, but I remember I traveled a lot in 1980 and ran into states where alcohol was either illegal or you could only get it at private clubs. Fortunately, you could join these clubs for $1 and have a good meal. But anyway, that would be my suggestion. Yes?
Yeah, well, you say that these unwritten laws that are American citizens' rights, is this something to be inherited from the English unwritten laws of the rights of the citizens? You said that on
Well, when you say unwritten laws, you mean, in a sense, our rights.
No, as I understand it, in England, they don't have a Bill of Rights, and you say that the fact that these unwritten laws that you're referring to could be an inherited thing from the English system of democracy?
Well, that's an interesting question, and you should get the Libertarian Reader and read various perspectives on that. It's an interesting historical question whether the founders of America were making the claim that we have the rights of Englishmen and you're violating them. The rights that Englishmen had built up from before Magna Carta and through Magna Carta and on through the Glorious Revolution. Or whether they were declaring these are the inherent and natural rights of all men. And I'm sure some were making each argument, and to some extent the first argument evolved into the second. I think they're both related to the point I made at the end of my talk, citing Frederick Douglass. Englishmen had to demand these rights. They didn't exist in a real sense. Englishmen had to demand them over the course of years. But yes, there's a sense in which American law rests on this Anglo-Saxon foundation where the liberties of the individual were protected. And you see it today. England does not have a written constitution, but they have some interesting, strong rules. One of them, for instance, is if you've ever been to London, there's a small part of London that is called the City of London. It's obviously expanded a lot since then. It's kind of the financial district. The Queen cannot enter the City of London without permission. Now, these days, don't worry, if she wanted to come there, she'd get permission, but that was the rule. The monarch could not come in there. I believe it's also, if you ever watch the Queen give the annual, it's kind of the State of the Union speech, except it's delivered by the monarch in England, there's this formal procedure where a messenger from the House of Lords goes to the House of Commons, raps on the door, and summons the parliamentarians to come to the House of Lords to listen to the Queen speak. And they have this old tradition. They slam the door in his face. They make him knock 3 times. And then the 3rd time, they let him in, they listen to his message, and they all walk over to hear the Queen give her speech. But this ceremony makes the point that the Commons don't have to, will not be summoned by the Queen, except by their own accord. In the United States, we operate more with a written constitution and a written Bill of Rights, and it's an interesting argument which one is really a better protection. But they both have deep roots, I think, both philosophically and historically. Yeah.
I'd like to ask you a question, something I read in the newspaper about the FBI absorbing the DEA and the Treasury Department. I know some people saw it, a lot of people didn't, and I think it was yesterday's paper.
Yeah.
But as a libertarian, having these 2 different agencies absorbed into a federal agency, how do you feel about that? These are your feelings on as a libertarian.
Well, that's an interesting question, and I don't know, I'm certainly not an analyst of the bureaucracy in general, but I think that we can overemphasize the value of efficiency in the federal government. This is something I think that libertarian-minded people may frequently hear a Ross Perot say, we're going to get in there and run that government like a business. Well, I don't really want the federal government to run like a business. I think businesses should run efficiently. And I like a little inefficiency among people who are using coercion against other people. So is it inefficient to have 3 different police agencies? Well, in the first place, there's a real question as to whether there's any constitutionality for the DEA and the DATF. But even if you're going to have them, my inclination, subject to being willing to listen to arguments, would be to say I just as soon keep them separate. We don't need one large federal police agency. Better, at least, they should be battling each other sometimes. But as I say, I'm not convinced of that. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
You were talking about human rights. Is there not any way to reinforce the United States to honor their signature on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that they signed into in 1948? They not only were supposed to prominently display this document, they were supposed to disseminate it